Well, good morning and welcome. I was saying to Michael Walsh, who heads up our marketing team yesterday, that it's wonderful to see this room set up like this again. It's been a while with COVID since we've had so many in this room. So it's great to be able to do a presentation where I'm not talking into the camera, no one in front of me. Today, we're talking about Workplace 2023. And I was just saying earlier that employers really are under siege. And I'll be talking about the reforms that have been introduced to the Federal Act in a moment. What I wanted to talk about was a snapshot of the Australian workforce. So what's it look like at the moment? Some of the longer term workplace trends that we're seeing in our practices, obviously the Fair Work reforms. We're spending a bit of time focusing on those, in particular how I think they're going to impact business in South Australia, other current issues, and some of the employment claims trends that we're seeing in our practice at the moment. So in terms of the workforce, Australia's population is roughly 25 million, and that's predicted to be 35 million by 2050. The workforce itself is about 13.7 million, and these figures are back to December 22. There's an employment population ratio of about 64 to 65%, which is the highest that's ever been in this country. Australia has about 490,000 job seekers, and that's clearly a low figure with an unemployment rate of 3.5 as at December 22, and that figure is obviously decreasing. In general terms, the trends we're obviously seeing are increase in employment, increase in hours worked by those who are employed. In terms of the long-term trends that we see in Australia, and I think this links into the reforms, is that there's been a clear long-term trend towards the individualisation of the private sector. Individualism rather than collectivism has become the norm. And this is evidenced through union density figures in Australia. So back in the 1970s, probably before most of us were born, union density was as high as 50%. By 1992, that had dropped to 40%. And today, there are about 1.5 million people who are union members. That is about 14.5% of the workforce. So union density has clearly dropped off a cliff. Education, public administration, healthcare are the most unionised sectors of the workforce. Interestingly, women are the majority of members in the public sector and men are the majority in the private sector. The figures released recently by the ABS in terms of breakdown between the private and the public sector indicate that at present, 8% of workers in the private sectors are members of the union. So you can see that at presently, the union membership is mainly within the public sector. What's probably more concerning for anybody in the trade union movement, 5% of workers aged between 15 and 19. So there's not going to be an uptick anytime soon. Trade union movement, though, still has a great deal of influence on our workforce. Australia's federal workplace laws, currently the Fair Work Act, continue to recognise the trade union movement in a range of situations, providing rights in areas such as right of entry, bargaining for enterprise agreements, and rights of appearance before the Commission. The effect of the individualisation of the asset on the private sector, though, is that there has been a more direct relationship between an employer and their workforce. Collective industrial action is no longer a part of the industrial landscape. Collective agreements in the form of enterprise agreements have become rare. There's a greater reliance on the safety net, that's the awards and the national employment standards, less formal contractual arrangements negotiated directly between an employer and their workforce, as well as an increase in the number of independent workers in particular independent contractors, which are used by disruptors such as Uber. We've also seen the proliferation of casual workers. In my time practicing as employment law, there's also been a move from regulation by the state to a federal workplace system, and that has come with additional complexities in terms of laws. In terms of the workplace reforms that have recently been introduced to the current federal industrial legislation, the Fair Work Act, the background to that, of course, is that in late May, the Labor Party formed government at the federal level under Anthony Albanese. Labor had come to power on an interventionist platform, the likes of which Australia has not seen at a federal level for many decades. In the area of industrial relations, Labor has promised that it would have greater regulation, in particular to address its concerns about matters such as insecure work. A regular target of the union movement, insecure work has of course been the subject of several High Court decisions focused on casual workers and independent contract workers in the last few years. Labor, with the support of the Greens, was able to pass its bill to amend the Fair Work Laws, known as the Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill 2022 last year. These reforms are some of the most significant permanent changes, and I use that word because we, of course, had the COVID changes to the Act, which were temporary, to the federal industrial relations system since the introduction of the Fair Work Laws in 2010. Significantly, each aspect of the bill will commence on a particular date, which is not all the same, which is a peculiar part of the bill. One of the areas where there is significant changes in the construction industry. Construction industry has, since the Royal Commission that dates back to the Howard era, had specific regulation, most recently by the Australian Building and Construction Commissioner. In effect, there was a separate act that was set up to try and address what was seen as the mischief of activities that occurred in that particular industry. That act had more significant penalties in relation to such matters as unlawful right of entry and unlawful industrial action. And the ABCC has been a bit of a political football where Labor, when it's got into power, has sought to do away with its powers, reduce its powers, and on this occasion has abolished the ABCC. So from late last year, the Fair Work Ombudsman will take on the responsibilities of workplace regulation in the field of the construction industry, and the construction industry will no longer have its own act. Any breaches will be breaches of the Fair Work Act, much like any other industry, so the same penalties will apply to that conduct, which are a lot less significant than the specific act that deal with the building industry. So that's a significant change. And in South Australia, we've obviously seen the CFMEU takeover by the Victorian branch, which has caused some concern by builders in the industry. In New South Wales, the response has been recently the government has announced that it's going to set up its own statewide ABCC to address what it sees as concerns in the industry. There's been no announcement by the Liberal opposition that they will take a similar path if they're elected to government. The other issue which has significantly changed is in the area of bargaining. Much of the talk in the media has been about multi-employer bargaining. In effect, what the reforms have done is they've reduced the barriers to the ability for employers to multi-bargain. That is, in effect, having a number of employers bargaining for one agreement which applies across the board. What's traditionally been called pattern bargaining. That, in my view, is not going to be significantly used outside a couple of sectors such as social services, which are largely funded by government. The reason for that is the low density of that union membership and the complexities that still exist around multi-employer bargaining. I think one of the more significant changes in this area is in relation to the commencement of bargaining. So before the reforms, an employer may choose to commence agreement-making processes on their own initiative. A variation of this is where an employer may agree in response to a request from a group of employees or their representatives, naming the union, to commence the process. Alternatively, where an employer refuses to commence the agreement-making process, in response to that, employees may make an application to the Commission which seeks what's called a majority support nomination. In effect, that's a vote of the workforce, and if the majority of the workforce decide that they want to commence bargaining, then the Commission will make such an order and bargaining will commence in accordance with that process. That hasn't regularly been used, simply again because of the lack of union density in the private sector. A key requirement then of the process once bargaining is commenced is for the issuing of what's called a notice of employee representation rights. No doubt many of you are familiar with that particular document. Upon provision of that to the workforce, an employee may then appoint the union as their bargaining representative during the agreement-making process stage. A key element of the reforms is that there is no need for one of these forms, the Notice of Employee Representational Rights, to be issued commence bargaining for a replacement enterprise agreement. So if you already have an agreement and the union and the workforce are looking at replacing it, there's no need to issue an NERR. And indeed, it is possible for an employee to write to you through their representative and ask for bargaining to commence. This is a more simplified process that's been introduced. There is certain criteria that applies, namely it needs to be a replacement agreement and it needs to be in circumstances where the nominal expiry date is no longer than 5 years and the new proposed agreement covers a substantially similar scope of employees. So in this case, the workforce and their union can easily commence bargaining through this simple written request process, and this removes an opportunity for an employer to resist bargaining in the case of an expired agreement. And that, in my view, is one of the more significant changes that's been introduced through these reforms, because this is an area where the unions and the workforce have had great difficulty in terms of recommencing negotiations, because there's already an enterprise agreement that's in place. It's expired, the effect of which is, of course, that it still continues, and there's been a lack of interest about negotiating another one. But this is a simple process by which the bargaining can be recommenced by the union and one single employee. And so, in my view, this is the most significant change in bargaining. The other area that's been subject to change is in relation to enterprise bargaining agreements themselves. And the biggest changes in this area relate to the procedural requirements for approval of an agreement, unilateral termination and the boot. So in terms of the procedural requirements, the reforms replace the current prescriptive pre-approval requirements for agreements, and anyone who's gone through the process will know how difficult it is. These processes include the issuing of an NERR and strict timeframes for key steps in the voting processes. This has been replaced sensibly, in my view, by a broader requirement for the Commission to be satisfied that the employees genuinely agreed to the agreement. And that will be a much simpler and easier process. A lot of agreements have not been approved on the basis that they haven't quite met these procedural requirements. So this is, quite frankly, a welcome move. The other area where there's been significant change is in relation to the termination of agreements. That is unilateral termination for agreements after they've expired. Previously, the Commission need only be satisfied that terminating an agreement which has passed its normal expiry date is not contrary to the public interest, and also take into account the views of the parties to the agreement. There has been an uptick in terms of the termination agreements, and there was a decision several years ago which looked at where, for instance, a business might have changed. That was a decision involving Queensland Rail, where what had happened there is that the business was previously operated as a state utility. It was privatised, and the new owners made an application to the Commission on the basis their business had changed and that the old state-based type entitlements were no longer appropriate to continue in a private sector model, and the Commission terminated on that basis. And that has led to a greater increase in the number of terminations over the last few years. And this has been a particular concern to the union movement, who have been concerned about entitlements being done away with where such agreements have been terminated. So the reforms change this, requiring the Commission to instead be satisfied of one of the following before terminating an existing agreement. Continued operation of the agreement will be unfair to the employees it covers. The agreement does not and is not likely to cover any employees. The continued operation of the agreement poses a significant threat to the viability of the business, and the employer gives a guarantee that it will preserve termination entitlements under the agreement. So you can see quite clearly from that new criteria related to termination, the Commission needs to consider that the reforms require the Commission to only terminate the agreement if only one of those criteria needs to be satisfied. But regardless of that, you can see it's a higher bar in terms of what needs to be satisfied in order for the Commission to terminate those agreements. Clearly, it's going to be more difficult to terminate old agreements when they're in place in a workplace. The changes relating to these came into effect in December last year. The other area which has been changed is the boot test. The reforms make changes to the boot to address some of the concerns that have been raised about its application in the past. In particular, the changes require the Commission to undertake the boot as a global assessment instead of a line-by-line comparison. I think all employers welcome that. Remember a few years back when the Coles enterprise agreement fell down on the basis of one store in one particular area, one part-time employee or the like. So instead of doing that line-by-line comparison, what's going to happen is there's going to be a global assessment. My reading of that is that it's going to be easier to pass the boot test for employers, particularly when you're dealing with a large workforce which has operations in different areas. So that's obviously a change that is welcome. That is not due to commence though until mid this year, so on the 6th of June this year. Some of the other reforms which are directed towards the employment relationship are significant. As I mentioned, the policy that Labor took to the election was focused on job security, and it proposed changes to regulation of casual employment, fixed-term contracts and contract arrangements in its policies. And Labor had justified these proposals, bearing in mind that the Fair Work Act, of course, was a Labor Act, that there had been changes over the last 10 years in terms of these arrangements, in particular the proliferation of these arrangements in Australia. So in relation to the issue of job security, what Labor has introduced is a new Fair Work objective into the Act. Now, probably it's not something that you look at every day, but there is a list of objectives in the Act. They include such things as providing workplace relations fair to working Australians, ensuring a guaranteed safety net, ensuring that that's fair, assisting employees to balance their work and family responsibilities, enabling fairness and representation at work, achieving productivity and fairness through an emphasis on enterprise level collective bargaining. So they're the, in general terms, the objectives that were in the Act before the reforms. And the objectives really reflect, on the one hand, the need to provide a legislative framework which is flexible for businesses and promotes productivity and economic growth, and on the other, the desire to ensure a framework that is fair and protects the rights of employees with guaranteed safety net. Labor has, through its reform, introduced a new objective, which is job security. Now, in terms of how this change might operate in practice, my view is that this is a significant change because it means that the Fair Work Commission must consider this issue in all of its decision making, which of course includes the federal annual wage review, and in relation to the consideration of awards in terms that may well be included. And it may well be that you might see in the immediate future there could be some introductions of terms in relation to this issue of job security into awards. The other area that Labor has addressed that has an impact on all of us from an employment perspective is, of course, the pay secrecy provisions. A pay secrecy clause is a common inclusion in contract of employment. I can recall when I first started working many years ago at a law firm that I had pay secrecy in my contract. The clause will generally provide that an employee's remuneration is confidential and prohibits employees from disclosing, discussing, and/or comparing salaries with one another. Breaches of those clauses have previously seen employers have a valid and lawful right to institute disciplinary action up to termination. Labor's reforms now make it a workplace right for employees to disclose or not disclose information regarding their remuneration and terms and conditions of employment required to calculate their remuneration. By making this a workplace right, it means that employees are protected from having adverse action taken against them from making such disclosures in the future. Further, employees are now entitled to make general protections claims if their employer takes such adverse action against them for having exercised that workplace right. So what that means for employers is we obviously need to review our contracts of employment to ensure that they don't contain pay secrecy provisions and we don't seek to enforce them in the future. That, again, was a change that came into place late last year. The other significant change is in relation to the area of flexible work. There is, of course, a right in relation to flexible work under the Fair Work Act that existed before the reforms. What the reforms do is amend the rules relating to requests for flexible work arrangements and introduces new provisions empowering the Commission to resolve such disputes regarding such requests. So what's changed? In terms of the scope, the reforms are built on the existing rights to request flexible working arrangements. And they now include situations where an employee or a member of their immediate family or household experiences family and domestic violence. So that's consistent with the new NES requirement. In terms of the obligation, so the obligation on the employer, the reforms insert a new section which requires an employer who receives a request for flexible working arrangements to meet with an employee to discuss their flexible work request, and where the employer intends to refuse the flexible work request, agree upon alternative changes to their working arrangements and note the agreed changes in the employee request, or if there is a refusal, outline the employer's reasonable business grounds for refusal and address the following: changes to the employee's working arrangements that would accommodate the employee's circumstances and that the employer would be willing to make, or that there are no such changes the employer could make to accommodate this employee's circumstances. In terms of the dispute, for the first time, the Act introduced a dispute resolution mechanism for circumstances where an employer has refused a flexible work request or not provided a written response as required, and the parties have been unable to resolve that dispute. The new provisions stipulate that where a flexible working arrangement dispute arises, conciliation should be the first avenue of dispute for the Commission, and then if that is not possible, there is an ability for the Commission to arbitrate the matter. And this quite clearly is a significant move because the Commission can now make orders in relation to flexible work arrangements. So the takeaway from these reforms, firstly, is that what's largely in the reforms is what some employers will be doing as a matter of best practice anyway. However, having said that, there is a requirement now to meet, and that requirement obviously must be met, as well as the response to any such request, particularly where it's denied. And in relation to a dispute, whereas it was not necessarily an easy avenue for employees to take in the past, this is an easy avenue to take, that is to refer it to the Commission, who can not only conciliate but arbitrate the dispute and make orders that might not necessarily suit the employer. So employers obviously need to be alive to these new changes. They commence on the 6th of June this year. So it seems to me to be appropriate for employers to be reviewing their policies to make sure they've got something in place to deal with such requests. Might get a flood of them in June and July of this year. So be alive to that possibility. Yeah.
With respect to the flexible work request, I know that take into account disability. With respect to disability, what does that mean? Is it just someone who has an injury and they're saying they need special circumstances to work from home or something, or is it like a recognised disability?
Sure. Well, certainly if somebody has a recognised disability, that would have to be
obvious.
Obviously that.
So you've got a non-work related injury. I'm just considering.
Even if it's a non-work related injury, it still, as the employer, need to take that into account because of disability, even if it hasn't. So the same obligation would apply in that situation, and as per the new requirements, you need to meet with him. If you're going to refuse the request for whatever reason, you need to detail the reasons as to why you were refusing the request in that situation. The other area where there has been change, which is significant for employers, of course, is in the area of fixed-term contracts. This is, of course, what Labor considers to be insecure work. And its reforms introduce provisions that effectively limit the use of fixed-term contracts for what is the same role to a period of 2 years, subject to certain exceptions, which I'll talk about in a moment. And to convert the fixed-term contracts to permanent employment contracts in certain circumstances. The prohibitions and regulations apply to both fixed-term contracts and what we call outer limit contracts. That is a contract with an expiry date with a general right to terminate. So just because you've got a general right to terminate in that fixed-term contract doesn't change the nature of the contract, the fact that these prohibitions apply. So in terms of the prohibition, it's that the engagement on the contract is cannot be for a period greater than 2 years, and that the employee has been engaged on consecutive fixed-term contracts, and the employee's total engagement under those contracts is greater than 2 years, or one of the contracts contains an option to renew or extend the contract for up to that period. So effectively, what you're talking about is a 2-year window for your fixed-term contracts. There are some exceptions to that, though, and there are a number of exceptions. So they include where the role is to perform only a distinct and identifiable task involving specialised skills. See a lot of arguments over those terms. Perform essential work during a peak demand period. Training arrangements, an employee who earns above the high income threshold, that's currently $162,000. For whatever reason, that group of employees isn't entitled to any benefits. And this is one of the things that they miss out on. So certainly for your higher earners, this is not an issue. It is an appointment to a governance position that is time limited, wholly or partly government funded, so they're going to make their own rules. Or a modern award permits the use of fixed term contracts. Now, that exception seems to be fairly toothless in circumstances where, as we know, what Labor's introduced into the objectives is job security. So you wouldn't have thought there's going to be a modern award that permits an extension beyond the 2-year period for fixed-term contracts. So employers are now obviously required to provide employees with a fixed-term contract information statement. Government seems to be pretty big on these information statements. We've had the original one, we've had the casual one, and now we've got the fixed-term contract information statement. And that needs to be provided before or as soon as practical after the contract is entered into. Those changes, as you're probably aware, have already commenced. They commenced in December of this year. Yeah.
So I'm going to just check you were speaking about the threshold, then price. Being over the threshold.
Yeah.
So that also applies secrecy clause as well.
I don't know I don't think that's right. I think pay secrecy applies across the board. I didn't see that come up in my reading. The other area of the reforms which have been well documented relate to equal pay, sexual discrimination, sexual harassment. In terms of equal pay, the Fair Work laws allowed the Commission to make a determination bearing on the more minimum wages if satisfied by work value reasons, which was defined to relate to any of the following: the nature of the work, the level of skill or responsibility involved in doing the work, or the conditions under which the work is done. The intention of this provision was to ensure the Commission could determine a wage floor for work of equal comparable value. The reforms enable the Commission to make such determination on its own initiative, and they now provide that it's appropriate for them to consider work value reasons must be free of assumptions based on gender and include consideration of whether historically the work has been undervalued because of assumptions based on gender. Now, the aim of these reforms is to provide a more effective mechanism to close the gender gap, and it may well be that we do see the Commission considering these issues and making more determinations in relation to minimums under awards, where there is a view on their part that the rates have stayed lower because of gender factors within that award. That's a fairly significant change in terms of the way in which the Commission is going to undertake its role. The other significant change is in the area of sexual harassment. Now, of course, obligations in relation to sexual harassment and discrimination are not new. There is both state and federal legislation that is directed towards both sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. What's significant about these changes, though, is that it's introducing it into the Fair Work Act. So the scope of the reforms is going to be the prohibition of sexual harassment in the workplace that extends to all workers, including employees, contractors, subcontractors, outworkers, apprentices, and so forth. Now, this, of course, is adopting the definition that we would have all seen in the work health and safety legislation. So it's a broad definition of worker that you get under that Act, which has been incorporated into the Fair Work Act. In addition, workers, prospective workers and persons conducting a business or undertaking will each be able to seek remedies under the Fair Work laws. So there's a broadening of scope in terms of who can bring such applications. The significance probably is not so much about the scope, but more about how you can actually address it in a practical sense through a dispute. So the reforms enable the Commission to deal with sexual harassment by continuing to provide for mechanisms for workers to seek and stop sexual harassment or to prevent future harassment, and dealing with a dispute, ordering compensation to remedy past harm caused by sexual harassment through mediation and conciliation. This is, in my view, significant. The Fair Work Commission is very quick to deal with matters that go before it by way of application. No disrespect to the other bodies that deal with sexual harassment. Certainly my experience is that it can take them time to deal with these applications. The Commission, in my experience, is much quicker. So this should lead to a much quicker remedy that's available subject to sexual harassment. If the matter remains unresolved, the parties can consent to either arbitration before the Commission or have the matter referred to a federal court. Central to these changes is the ability for applications to be made jointly by multiple agreed persons, as well as by a union, as opposed to a single individual. This will enable the Commission to deal with multiple parties together if it is appropriate to do so. For example, where there is a common perpetrator or principal or work location where the sexual harassment has occurred from a practical perspective. This again is a significant change because of course sexual harassment has been dealt with on a case-by-case basis, where one individual making the complaint has their complaint dealt with, and the Commission in the past has been reluctant to go beyond that particular application, but you can tell the approach is changing, where it clearly envisages multiple people making such applications where, for instance, there is one alleged perpetrator in relation to the conduct. So that's a fairly significant change in terms of sexual harassment. Yeah.
Is there a compensation cap for sexual harassment?
I don't think there is, because I think it's general damages. So you're taking it to court, so it'll be general damages. So it's not the same as another offence misappropriation. Okay, I'm just going to touch on some of the current workplace trends that we're seeing. In terms of the nature of work relationships, one of the key long-term trends remains the continuation of the use of independent contractors. Independent contractors, of course, have different rights and obligations to employees, and they obviously don't have the same rights that are extended through these reforms. Traditionally, courts have looked at the whole relationship between the parties. This is known as the multi-indicator test to determine if a worker in a disputed situation is an employer or an independent contractor. In February of last year, the High Court handed down a couple of decisions about independent contractor relationships, one entitled Personnel Contracting, the other one ZG Operations Australia. In those decisions, the High Court distanced themselves from the multi-indicator test, determination of whether a worker is an employer or an independent contractor. In doing so, the High Court has made it clear that the critical issue is the parties' description of their relationship, in particular through any written agreement. So that was a significant change in terms of approach, in terms of the nature of the relationship, and no doubt that will continue to lead to the greater use of independent contractors. Some of the other things we're seeing are quite obviously all this basic labour shortages and wage pressure at the moment. In the most recent Fair Work wage review undertaken by the Commission noticed significant labour shortages in Australia at the moment that have been exacerbated by COVID and the lack of immigration over the last few years to Australia. In terms of the effect of that, obviously the effect of that is wage pressure. That's seen a significant increase in wages over the last few years, creating enormous pressure for employers. Most recently because of rising costs in other areas such as building material and electricity, and employers have looked to provide greater flexibility as a means to keep and attract staff. Cost of living pressures, they certainly continue. They've been accelerating the last 6 months or so. The Fair Work wage review in its most recent decision made some significant increases to minimum wages. There was a 5.2% increase in the national minimum wage and a 4.6% increase to on-board minimum wages. That in effect led to a $40 a week increase in the minimum wage, increasing it to $812.60, and an increase in the national minimum hourly rate to $21.38, which is an increase of just over $1 an hour. The increases, of course, commenced in the middle of last year, and it now means that a level 2 private sector clerks award is earning $31 an hour. The Fair Work Commission will, of course, need to address similar circumstances this year as it's commenced its process of doing the review for this year. And certainly our expectation is that there will be at least another 5% increase in minimum rates that decision gets handed down later on in June. And those rates continue mid-year. Some of the other factors, as I said, a lot of employers are looking at the issue of flexibility as an alternative to wage increases. And there was a report from the CSIRO going back to 2016, which of course is pre-COVID, titled Tomorrow's Digitally Enabled Workforce. And certainly when that was issued, there was a bit of lip service paid to it. No one probably gave it credit that it now deserves now that we've gone through COVID. But what that was suggesting in that report was that there would be increased technological change, rapid growth of the freelance employment market, co-working facilities, home. Of course, these trends have only been exacerbated by COVID, as we know. Over 4.3 million of Australia's workforce was working from home in March 2021. And I appreciate that that was during the COVID era. Over half of those workers were in the finance industry and public administration, industries that have increased their use of technology. Certainly in the legal industry, we've seen greater use of telecommunications, including Teams, as a way to do hearings and indeed in trials. I did a trial last year. It's done by the Fair Work Commission, entirely done on Teams, which is an interesting experience. I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. Workers across the country have established home offices, providing a boom for companies like Officeworks. And in a number of workplaces, workers have enjoyed these developments and wish to continue to work. Employers are, with the current labour shortages, having to accommodate many of these desires of workers. And the government, interestingly, has recently encouraged the leaders in the finance industry to look back to the offices for their workforces, realising that there's been a permanent shift in terms of working from home. At the same time, they are threatening to encourage people to come back to the office. I might just touch now on some of the employment claim trends we've seen. And again, this illustrates the difference between the individual and the collective. In terms of individual claims, we are still seeing a large number of individual-based claims rather than collective claims. The days of industrial action are well and truly gone. It's very rare to see industrial action take place or other forms of collective action. An unfair dismissal application remains the employment claim of choice for employees of the private sector. The Commission's annual report indicates that of the 30,000 plus applications that are dealt with last financial year, that almost half were unfair dismissal applications. Historically, applications would often be represented by the union or recently their lawyer. A recent trend we've experienced is that a large number of applicants who commence their applications are self-represented. And in response to this, the Commission has introduced its workplace advisory service, which seeks to connect both employees and indeed employees who can assist and advise them in relation to the application. And that principally because the Commission was having difficulty spending the additional resources and time that was necessary where parties are self-represented and appearing before them in relation to application. My observation is the further recent trend seems to be the logic of workers' compensation claims for psychological illness in response to disciplinary action taken by employers. That seems to be coming earlier and earlier, whereas days gone by, you might see that in response to something like a termination. You're even seeing it in response to a meeting. So that's certainly a trend that we're observing in our offices. So I'll leave it there, but I'm certainly happy to take any questions that people have, particularly in relation to the reforms that have been introduced by Labor. Yes.
Take secrecy. Where do bonuses fit in? Because is that seen as part of someone's normal pay, or can they have pay secrecy?
Well, you know, I would see that as part of the remuneration makeup. So I would see this as something. And I should add that, of course, arrangements in relation to Directors, for instance, have been subject to ANZ's rules for some time. The theory of those rules was that it would create a level of transparency as to what people paid. I think the practical experience would be that there's been a race to the top in terms of people finding out what others are earning and seeking more. So I don't know that it's really worked in terms of practice. So it's be interesting to see how these pay secrecy. Because the aim is to try and address the gender gap. So it'd be interesting to see how that.
Thank you.
Patrick.
Yeah, so clearly the secrecy is addressed. Dealing with the gender gap. Bottom line sense.
Yeah.
How do you think it might deal with the situation of somebody who spoke with for people to different?
Well, I think it's about what it's doing is creating a workplace right for you. So the workplace right relates to your, it seems to me. So the effect of that is exactly as you described it, that is you've got a right to talk about it with your colleagues or potentially others. That is your arrangements. But it seems to me it raises different considerations if you are taking information and then sharing it with a competitor. That it seems to me is breaching your obligations of face to your employer. It seems to me to be able to take action against you, because that's the purpose for which you disclose the information.
That's also shown in the way that what advertisement's been shown with salaries being made public.
Yeah.
We've actually done a competitive advantage to actually see what our competitors are basing on. We're trying to maintain our percentage on top of now that we know their position.
Sure.
And so it's just interesting. You know, it's,
Yeah. I think it, pretty clearly it all leads to a raising of wages because those who are getting less than what their colleagues are getting, for instance, going to be asking. Those who are getting more won't do anything. But it's going to be those who are earning less, clearly are going to be knocking on your door, wanting an uplift. But that seems to be the practical thing.
We recently saw it go the other way where we're bringing somebody in and we said we'd like to pay them more, but really we're not going to based on how that might. So it's actually had the
Oh, look, I
flip
think,
side in reality.
I think certainly when you're,
And they came on board.
yeah, certainly when you're onboarding somebody, that's something you have to think about.
But it's
Because
it's
you know,
a really,
you know that they can come and talk about it today.
yes, so it's a really
So you're not going to pay them $50,000 more and onboard them for the same role.
It's very challenging.
It is. Well, that's the other factor, of course, is, and you obviously got to balance that up in terms of the need for resource.
Secrecy clauses in contracts. And
Yeah.
it's sufficient just to say that the remuneration clause is subject to secrecy and the rest still have private confidential.
No, I think that's an appropriate approach to take. I mean, it seems to me that the standard confidentiality clauses still apply. So when you're talking about business information, I think that still applies. But certainly in my experience, there's quite often a specific reference in those clauses to the remuneration, which of course needs to be excised from.
And it's been ironic, fixed 2-year terms for employees, but fixed 4-year terms for MPs.
Well, I must say, I was talking to somebody who I won't reveal who they were, but they were making a fair point that a lot of these fixed term contracts have been driven by government who fund for certain periods of time. And of course, that links into a fixed term contract from the employer's perspective when you're getting funded by government. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because that, in my experience, is whether you're in hospital or other government funded work, that's certainly driven fixed term contracts. So it's really something that they've introduced more than anybody else in my experience. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Watch this space.
That's other than those.
Correct.
That man, has there been any discussion of the second around the issue? Right. Never mind.
No,
It's just.
no, I mean, discussion, yeah. As I say, there seem to be different rules that apply, because I know teaching is another example where fixed term contracts apply in the public sector, as we all know. So I haven't heard any noises from the Melbourne government about introducing such restrictions. Nor would you expect them to, bearing in mind the great use that state governments use of these arrangements. Sitting.
It's term contracts and exemptions, government. That was tied to no prospect of reason.
Yeah, correct.
Funding kind of thing.
Correct.
It was
Correct,
not
that's
just
right.
that it's government funded.
Yeah, correct.
Just that you're not too sure whether you'll see it, but really.
So if you were allocated, for instance, for a year system with that, take a position that funding beyond that, such a fixed term arrangement is reasonable. And this really links into this discussion about government funding and allocating for a yearly basis. So it seems to me it's basically saying, well, we introduce one more for the private sector, but give that exemption where it's government funded.
What do you have the funding is?
If you have that funding for years and years and years, it seems to me difficult to make use of that exemption.
Then I was just going to take on a different tangent with
Yeah.
around flexible work and how it relates to awards.
Yes.
I'm finding that we're getting a lot of requests for flexible works, but it actually is a contradiction to the award as to, for example, can I start at, let's call it 5:30
sure.
a.m. It's my flexible right. I'm over, a certain age or within a certain bracket. And therefore, I'm trying to understand how the award plays out, because that includes penalty rates. It could be a night shift type of arrangement where we've got to then balance the books. Have you come
Yeah.
across much of that yet?
Oh, we are. We're certainly seeing that. I mean, it's preferable if that can be represented in an enterprise agreement. And certainly my experience as a commission has been reasonably flexible about having industrial arrangements.
Yeah.
Now, that, to be clear, that is where the request is coming from. Not where. Clearly, where
Yes.
it's demanded by the employer, you're going to be paying penalty rates.
So where we don't have an EA, you would suggest that fair agreements in writing where it's an individual request that those penalty rates may not apply.
They might not apply
But they may.
if you've got a request.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
But I certainly wouldn't be doing it the other way.
Absolutely. It's more just, by doing the right thing by your employee, how you're going to get stung the other
Yeah,
way
sure.
to have an underpayment claim.
Well, it's a particular problem for part-time employees, for instance, where some of you might be aware that with the part-time arrangements, you've got to set the days and the hours of work.
Yes.
And then you might have the part-time say, well, can I do an extra hour here or there? And the question arises to whether that's subject to overtime.
Yeah. I'm sort of finding it more so with like Parks Award and Wholesale Award.
Yeah.
Whereby it's like, I want to start early and an allowance kicks in.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, certainly up north, some of my clients up north,
Yeah.
where the weather's lovely, about 3 o'clock.
They want to
They want to start as early as
Fine.
possible. That's all right.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, well, look, I might call it a day there. Thank you all very much for coming in for this face-to-face session today, and feel free to stay around for a coffee or something to eat.